Thank you, Millie. Thank you very much for arranging this evening. A month ago, the topic was planned, and look what's happened. So welcome, everybody. We do start on time. We know how busy you are, and we end at 8:25, and we've got a lot to cover, so I'm not going to say very much at all, except to encourage you, please, this is your meeting. If you're not getting a briefing, or you're not hearing the other sides explained, please say early. Don't wait till 8:25 and say you were disappointed. Say it at 7:02. I've sat in too many audiences bored, and we intend to discuss this life-changing issue properly, which means with you telling us where you want us to go. We do intend to keep our discussion in 4 areas. Obviously, we'll end with predictions, but the 3 other ones are update on the situation on the ground, the protesters, the regime. Those are our topics. So welcome, everybody. Could I ask you, panelists, please, to introduce yourself? And would you give us, in a statement that is short, your question or your briefing for us tonight, the thing you most want us to know at this critical time, starting with you, Malik.
Thank you. My name is Malik Al-Abda. I'm chief editor of Baroda TV, a Syrian opposition television station based in London. I'd like to frame the debate on Syria in a way that I think is most accurate, in a way that I think best reflects the reality on the ground.
Which is?
Which is that it's not a struggle between opposition and the government, but between the desire for democracy and a dictatorship that doesn't want democracy to flourish.
Sue.
My name is Sue Lloyd-Roberts. I work for BBC's Newsnight. I think I was the first broadcast journalist to get into Syria after the Troubles began. What I would like to talk about...
Can you hear? No.
Sorry. My name is Sue Lloyd-Roberts. I work for BBC's Newsnight. I think I was the first broadcast journalist to get into Syria about a month ago after the Troubles began. I last met Malak at the Reith Lectures when we were talking to Aung San Suu Kyi. I'm not going off the subject, but what I would like to talk about is a point that a Burmese monk once said to me a couple of years ago. Can any revolutionary movement, can any people succeed when the government shows an insatiable and consistent appetite for firing on and murdering its own people?
Daniel?
My name's Daniel Pye. I'm a freelance journalist, and I was deputy editor of Current Affairs magazine in Damascus.
Can you speak?
Sorry.
Is there any? Do we have any amplification at all? Because if so, let's put it to use. Do go on, Daniel.
It's okay. I'll speak up. So I worked as a freelance journalist in Syria, and I arrived back on Sunday. I arrived in Damascus on mid-February, and I guess what I would like to talk about is the growing movement in Syria.
Speak up, please, Daniel.
The growing movement in Syria, which may be disorganised and chaotic and have many different elements to it. But there is a movement of people that I think people all over the world should listen to and do everything they can to understand.
Hello.
Okay, my name is Ammar Waqqaf. I'm a management consultant here in the UK, a Syrian citizen as well. I came from Damascus like 10 days ago. I represent the point of view that the best way forward for Syria is to keep the current government and have a change from within. My message for today is that so far the media coverage of the problem has intensified it. The one-sided view stroke incitement of the media so far has sent the wrong messages to the demonstrators. And now the government, the Syrian government, even though it has many points to declare, it cannot, give it to everybody else in the outer world. So this is what I would like to talk about today.
And to you, Christopher.
Hi, my name's Chris Phillips. I'm the Syria analyst for the Economist Intelligence Unit. I also recently completed a PhD which looks at national identity in Syria, and that involved me living in Syria for 2 years. I can talk a bit about the economic situation later on if people want to, which can probably be best summarised as absolutely dire. But I'd actually, the point I'd really like to raise to the floor is about the issue of sectarianism in Syria. And my research actually, I met many people that actually would suggest that sectarianism isn't as prominent in Syria as the media really want to portray it. But I'm very worried about recent reports that I've heard of attacks on different groups, particularly in Homs, and I would like to raise that point with the group.
Okay, right, thanks. So we're coming to you straight after this question to the panel. Would the two journalists give us the best that you have as an update? If any of you are logged into the news, there's a Security Council meeting going on. If you have an update for that, please give it to us, or if you see any other social media reporting during the evening. But Sue and Daniel, you don't go on, but will you tell us what's happening in Hama, what the situation is in other cities? You start, Sue, and if you don't know, it's fine, because we know you're in London.
Sure, okay. And in Hama, as you've seen in the last few days, the army have fought back, the regime have fought back. They estimate some 140 fatalities and many more wounded. Hama enjoyed a kind of UDI for a while. It became a little enclave, trying to prove to the world how Syrians could govern themselves, if you like, before the army decided to move in. Ramadan was always going to be an explosive month for Syria. As you probably know, that in Syria you can be arrested if a group of people meet in a public place, which is why during Ramadan, when thousands go to their mosques routinely every day, it was going to be a chance to focus political dissent and to set off demonstrations. And this is what has happened, and the army was waiting for it to happen, and my God, have they retaliated in a brutal way.
I was in Hama last week, and at that time it was... Really?
Sorry, we're going to have to give you a microphone.
No,
yeah, we want to hear you, Daniel. Just well, this is the audience microphone, so
I
the more you speak, the less they can.
Hello?
Use it very close and do go on.
Okay.
Start again.
So I was in Hama last week. At the time, it was still part of this enclave, you could call it. There was no security on the streets, no military, no police. When I arrived into the city, the streets were, I say being controlled, they were full of young kids, manning barricades, standing in the streets. Mostly, you know, they were carrying sticks and so on, but they were very young kids, most of them teenagers. And we travelled around the city. I saw no evidence of violence, no evidence of weapons, although I know there are weapons in Hama. And there are weapons all over Syria. Syria's it's very easy to get hold of guns and munitions, but people haven't used them, or in very few occasions people have used weapons. I know there is an armed resistance. I see. But the situation there now is, I'm amazed by the restraint of the people in so many places who've faced military, faced security, faced torture, and have not carried out a full armed insurrection.
And Malik, what moment is this? What in the Syrian uprising? What moment is the Hama tank put down?
Well, I think obviously we're in the first week of Ramadan. We have another 3 weeks to go. I think if the regime after Ramadan, basically 29th of August, if the regime emerges stronger than what it is now, then I think we could very well see the beginnings of a civil war in Syria, because the slogan from the beginning of the revolution was, this was the slogan in Dar'a when the revolution began, was death over indignity, al-maut wal al-madalla. People would rather die than continue to live under Assad. And I think this is the feeling shared by the majority of the protesters. So there's no going back as far as they're concerned. And if they know that if things go back the way they were, they will all be arrested, because there is still a network of informers. However, after Ramadan, if the regime is visibly weakened, then I think we could well spell the beginning of the end for Bashar al-Assad. So the next 3 weeks will be crucial.
And we're coming to your predictions at the end of the evening. But to you, Chris Phillips, do you agree with this assessment? The whole Arab Spring is condensed into 3 weeks in Syria. We'll know if the uprising succeeds within 3 weeks.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that assessment. I think Malik wasn't quite so generalist there. I wouldn't say the entire Arab Spring is condensed into this week. The Syrian uprising is certainly at a key juncture. This is the moment that the gloves have completely come off by the regime. There's no pretense anymore that that Bashar in particular is some kind of reformer, is some kind of character that isn't willing to use violence. He's clearly been involved in this, and he's clearly willing to use force. Now, the one thing I would say, just in a slight disagreement with Malik, would be that in order for a civil war to break out, you need to have another side. You need to have people that are actually fighting back. Now, one of the reasons I understand that the pro sort of peaceful movement is taking that slogan is because they know full well that if ever they give the regime a genuine opportunity to crush them, a genuine justification, they will be smashed, because the only arms that can be got hold of are small arms. They will be absolutely crushed. It's not like in Libya, whereby you've had large segments of the military with hardware switch sides to fight against them. So a civil war, I think, is a bit of an exaggeration.
We're in the area of discussion, which is the update of the situation on the ground. So I will come back to that. And yourself, your update on the situation on the ground. What is your view? You've said you don't want a change of regime. What is the critical nature of the timing right now, in your eyes?
Well, what is happening now is that the situation, as Malik described, it's not going to wait until Ramadan ends, till civil war looms. It's already starting. And in my humble opinion, this is the reason why the regime has toughened up, because if it hasn't, then the other side is going to take matters into their own hands. That's the whole perception. Syrian society now is very much polarized. What I have seen in Damascus in the past 10 days, or since, well, when I visited a couple of weeks back, is myself during the 1980s, growing up, idolizing the president, and, idolizing the military. That's how the die-hard supporters of the government are being reared at the moment. And this is not good for a democratic future into Syria. But the general feeling is that there are sectarian problems. My cousins live at the very forefront in Homs, the front line, in a sense, in Homs, where there have been a lot of sectarian tension and the most clear sectarian problem so far. And they told me that the people in the streets do not listen to the wise people of the other majority, or the other, the Sunni people.
So do you think the regime is right to toughen up now?
If it doesn't, then people will take matters into their own hands.
So that's a yes?
It is a yes, yes.
Right,
indeed.
now, so we're coming to you. Does anyone in the audience want to come in at this juncture? You don't have to at the moment. Good, fine. So,
There's somebody there.
yes, to you. Sorry, I beg your pardon. You, madam, yes. If you'd like to use the microphone. This is about the update on the ground.
Hi, my name is Fatima Isawi. I'm a Lebanese journalist based in London, and I review every day hours, all Facebook pages, YouTube. So I can say that first, I did not find till now one single sectarian slogan in Facebook and web pages developed by Syrian activists. Talking about civil war, you need to have two parts equally armed. What we say till now is a regime empowered by extreme force and peaceful civilians fighting against it. I think that any kind of reform coming from the Assad regime is just now and after what happened, just impossible. Thank you.
What is your update? What is happening? Is it 3 weeks to decide the future of the Syrian uprising?
No one can say that we know what will happen. The future is very bleak. We don't know what will happen, and I don't think that 3 weeks will be. We will see the end of it in 3 weeks. I don't think it's realistic.
How do you characterize the situation on the ground now, as a journalist? What do you say is happening in Hama and in Syria?
I think it's, unless we have media covering what's going on really, we cannot say what's going on. We don't know. We just rely on YouTube, on propaganda sent by the media regime. We don't know what's going on. Thank you.
Well, first of all, slogans of sectarian nature were there from the day one. Alawis to the grave and Christians to Beirut. That's one slogan. Alawis to the sword and their women for pleasure. That's another slogan. There have been many. We've seen that, we've heard that, and if they're not reported to you, then I don't know who your sources are. Second, A Lebanese colleague of yours called Ghadi Francis from Asafir newspaper went to Hama, just like Daniel did, and he said, this is the Kandahar of Syria. You're not reporting this. And I go back to my main point. The media is not reporting. The media are not reporting.
But how can we if we're not invited in?
No, I mean, some BBC journalists did go in, didn't they?
Yeah, but not by invitation.
I fully agree with you. But
We've been asking to go in for 8 weeks now, 3 months now.
And
Not allowed in.
when Sue went in, she posed as a student of Byzantine history.
I got me in.
And it got
yes, I know. I mean, I can tell you a little bit about this. I
Yeah, well,
disagree
hang on,
totally.
we're going to have other views, but
No,
you've
fine.
been giving yours. And, no, thank you for giving your views. Malik, it's largely your fault.
Oh, that's not true. I haven't come across any sectarian slogans, and certainly the people that he's talking about, referring to, and let's be quite honest, you're talking about the Sunni majority in Syria, that they're sectarian. Well, that's simply not true, because otherwise Hafiz al-Asad and Bashar al-Assad would never be in power if the Sunni majority in Syria were really that sectarian people.
I have
In
to
fact,
agree on that.
I do remind you, when 1971, when President Hafiz al-Assad visited Hama, they slaughtered sheep, something like about 30 sheep for the president. So there isn't actually in Syria a sectarian feeling among the Sunni majority. So let's put that to one side. In fact, the protesters have been very keen not to avoid anything which may be interpreted even as being sectarian, because they know this is counterproductive. But I'm very disturbed by calling Hama the Kandahar of Syria, because to me it appears that in fact you're the one who is employing sectarian language when you describe a majority Sunni town or city like Hama with a population of 800,000 as being Kandahar. I mean, even Kandahar in Afghanistan is not being bombarded the way that the Assad forces are being bombarding Hama.
So let's not get distracted. The question of the update of the situation on the ground, have you all given us your briefing on that?
Yes.
Do any of you on the panel want to move on from anything from another part of the country, on refugees? We wanted to know your update. Have you missed an important point?
With regard to the refugees,
I'll come to you in a second. Have you, Sue?
Many, but I think you might
Well,
be-
mention one of them.
This idea of sectarianism in the country. I've heard sectarian slogans at demonstrations, anti-regime demonstrations. They are maybe perhaps one person in a crowd, shouts something. Everybody else says, no, this is not what we're about. We are here as one people against the regime. And this is a widespread feeling.
I would just add to that I think when we're talking about divisions in Syria, you've got to look at the various different divisions that are existing, and a lot of them are economic as well as they are sort of sectarian. So for example, my update as such, I was speaking to various people from Homs recently, and what was really interesting is in the sectarian violence that took place there, it took place in poor Alawi neighbourhoods. It was recent economic migrants to the city were involved in that. It wasn't the established middle class Alawis that had been there for a long time, that were part of the merchant class. It was a very small segment of a economic strata of society, and I think that analysis is often missed off when we look at sort of the media analysis of the situation.
So let's move on to that now. You've explained that there's civil war either looming or underway, that there's casualties in the historic city of Hama, that you don't want to change, that the rest of you do want change. We're going to come to the regime in a moment, but now we'll pick up with the protesters. You've been living in Damascus, Daniel, as a Westerner. Who do you think these protesters are, and who has the right to tell us who they are?
I'll answer the second part first. I think the only people who have the right to determine who are the protesters themselves. As I mentioned before, it's a very disorganised movement, and there are many different actors, different people involved in this movement. There are exiled groups who have links with networks within Syria. There are also these local coordination committees who, over the last few months, have become more organised, but began as very disparate groups of mostly young men. There's a women's movement. It's an entire spectrum of a people's movement.
Sue? would you add anything?
A movement of discontent. I just want to make one very basic point that was made by no less than Mrs. Assad in an article a year or two ago, that you can't forget the demographic of Syria, and indeed much of the Middle East. We're talking about a demographic which is 60% of the population are under 30. And the perception I got from so many young people I spoke to in Syria was just deep frustration with the status quo, with corruption, with the inability to get on in life, houses, jobs, without bribes, without knowing the right people. They get very, very impatient with the government's paranoia of always blaming Israel and outside forces. I was told time and time again, this is just discontent with really humdrum, everyday frustrations in life.
And how did these disparate groups communicate? In Egypt there was a use, in Tunisia there was a less use of the social networks. There was Al Jazeera English, was cited as a very major influence in Egypt at the time, and so on. But how are groups in Syria communicating?
I mean, they do use Facebook, they use social networking, Twitter. They also use simple means of communication, arranging in coffee shops, speaking. It is really very many ways. But like I say, there is not a coherent organisation.
And Malik, what would you add on this question of who are the protesters?
Yeah, actually it's one of the strengths of the Syrian revolution. There isn't a coherent, it's not a top-down revolution at all. In two words, I would say it's civil society. I mean, in a very embryonic stage, civil society is emerging in Syria. These youth groups, the local coordination groups, and also Syrian Revolution Coordinators Council and so on, these are youth groups which have emerged in Syria, first of all at a neighborhood level or a village level, and then they're hooked up with other neighborhoods, and now they're organizing themselves on a city-wide or even a province-wide level, and now even on a national level. So you got the shabab, the youth, the young people in Syria, but also women's groups. And women have been very active in the Syrian revolution. In fact, two of the most active, let's say, figureheads in Syria at the moment. Suhail al-Atasi, she's a woman. Fida al-Hurani, she's from Hama, she's also a woman. And also Razan Zaytoune, very prominent human rights activist, she's also a woman. So it's a very diverse mix, but I would say it all comes under the banner of civil society versus the militarized society of the Ba'ath Party, of the Assad family, of the Assad clan. That's the way I would describe the battle in Syria at the moment.
Sort of free people against a militarized society.
Absolutely.
Amar?
Well, there are a few groups at the same time on the streets. You have the protesters who, just like rightfully Sue said, for dignity reasons, we do not want to bribe a policeman anymore. We want equal opportunity with regards to economics and so on. And we don't like the tycoons who are eating everything, really. So you have these factions. You have another faction that is influenced, I think, from the outside. With regard to this particular faction, it's not completely influenced because it's, you know, it has a certain, on the ground presence. But for example, when I was in Damascus a couple of weeks back, a taxi driver said we were going to this restaurant in Bab Touma, and there was a demonstration, a pro-government demonstration at the time, so we couldn't take the car and we took a taxi. So the taxi driver said, don't you think this is provocative, that some people are dying and some people and the other people are celebrating in the streets? And I said, yes, well, some of those people would see you getting out in the streets all the time seeking to confront that much, and at the end of it we might not get any democracy out of this at all. Is a sort of provocation. And he said, well, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to leave the country to Ahmadinejad and Khamenei and Hassan Nasrallah of Lebanon? So you have these people who suddenly are thinking about a Sunni Shiite regional conflict rather than a Syrian issue, which is, as Sue rightfully said, there is a sort of dignity that something like that. There is also the economic problem. A lot of people, a lot of youngsters cannot find a job. And to add to that, if I am an engineer, for example, if I am a good engineer, that doesn't mean that I will have an opportunity to express my engineering skills. I will have to, be friend with someone, bribe someone, and that's very frustrating.
But are you saying that people are dying because they want to be engineers?
No. What I'm saying is that a lot of young men are feeling frustrated.
So why are they putting their lives on the line? Because of
Because
job
they want the regime
opportunities?
change. They want regime change.
And are they right?
Of course they are.
They're right to want regime change.
Of course they are. But how to change the regime is the question. Do you change it from inside without bloodshed? Do you overthrow it and risk an all-out problem? That's the whole thing.
Well, there
This
is
the
bloodshed, and it's not going to stop.
Well, you ain't seen nothing yet. If you think this is bloodshed, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Right, let's take the question from the audience is, what do you know that we don't know?
Well, I know what people tell me, and probably they don't tell you. What people tell me is that they are afraid in their houses from this one person in a demonstration that shouts sectarian shouts, that he might cause a bloodshed that cannot be, ended very soon.
Coming to the audience in a moment. You, Daniel, then you.
I just wanted to follow up on what you said. I think in Syria, the biggest, the most divisive force in terms of sectarianism is the regime. And I think for 40 years, they have used the different sects in Syria as a strategic game. If you look at the makeup of every cabinet, there is always one person from Daraa, one person from Homs, from Hasaka, from there. They use this, and they use it very cleverly.
Okay, now to you in the audience, this is about the protesters, please.
Yes, Avi. I spent last week in Beirut, where I had some...
Use the microphone, I beg your pardon. Point it right at your mouth.
I had some very interesting conversations with close leadership of Saad Hariri, also Hezbollah and Hamas. And and what I heard gave me the impression that what's going on in Syria is not going to remain contained within the borders of Syria, that as it aggravates, it will spread out in Lebanon, and eventually Turkey on the side of the Turks in the north of Syria, and Iran to protect its own Kurds from the infection will have to come in, and it will grow up into a conflagration.
Okay, so Sue,
One thing, Paddy, one more, that I read this slogan, Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the coffins. I read it in the New York Times 3 weeks ago, and they reported that it was heard in Homs.
Okay, now our friend here is saying, Sue, that this is the protesters in Syria are proxy fighters. Do you want to comment on that, and we'll take other comments from the audience?
My experience in Beirut was that the Syrians who had fled to Beirut, to Lebanon, were having a very uncomfortable time. The anti-regime asylum seekers, if you like to call them, that there were knocks on the door at night. At night they were being intimidated. They were being rounded up. So I don't know where this is going to end. Could I pass this on to Malik?
Yes, we're going to move on a bit. What do they want, the protesters? You've said what you think, who you think they are. What do they want?
Well, it's funny because now what people, before the slogan was people want the downfall of the regime. Now people are saying we want the downfall of the president, precisely because of the point that Ammar raised. Some oppositionists are being very clever in the way they use language, and even the regime itself. They're saying, well, actually, we can change the regime, but essentially keep the existing power structure, but maybe curb some of the excesses of the security forces and make some cosmetic changes, and maybe co-opt part of the opposition to become part of the government, maybe. And this is the roadmap, which was actually uncovered by Ian Black in The Guardian. So there's this idea that the regime can stay in place, but we can make certain changes, and life can go on. I don't think this is a very realistic prospect. And you mentioned Ahmadinejad and Hezbollah and so on. Well, when the Syrian people for the last 30 years have had Iran and Hezbollah shoved down their throats on a daily basis, pictures of Hassan Nasrallah together with Bashar al-Asad in taxis and every public space, I think people have a right to say, well, our tormentor, who is Bashar al-Assad, why is Hassan Nasrallah, who is a Lebanese, who claims to be fighting Israel, propping up Bashar al-Assad. So it's very natural for people for there to be a natural reaction against these people. But on a wider issue, the Syrian regime has gained its legitimacy from abroad because it doesn't have an internal legitimacy. It's not democratically elected. So it gets its legitimacy by allying itself with powerful forces such as Iran and Hezbollah. So it's very natural, now that this regime is in trouble, that it will call on these external forces, Iran and Hezbollah, to save it from the Syrian people. So if anything, it's Hezbollah fighters, it's Iranian Revolutionary Guards who will be fighting the Syrian people, quite possibly, if the regime ever reaches a level where its existence is in
I thought
threat.
you were claiming this already.
No, I never claimed it.
I thought, the opposition is already claiming that
some people
Hezbollah
have
is
suggested-
fighting, and
some people have suggested this. I haven't suggested it myself.
And I asked, what do the protesters want? What do you want?
I want the end of Bashar al-Assad's regime, entire regime. He needs to go. There's a whole very morally corrupt regime which has currently ruled Syria for the last 30, 40 years. That needs to go.
To you next, after you. What your question? The question for you is, what do the protesters want?
Well, I think Malik's made a very fair point in sort of highlighting that there's actually been a snowball effect, and people initially just wanted reform and have moved on to now calling, first of all, change the regime and now completely change the president. But I think actually a key point is being missed here, which isn't about necessarily who's on the street; it's about who's not on the street, and that's about there are key segments of society and key geographical regions, particularly central Damascus and Aleppo, which is absolutely key, which are not joining in this uprising at the moment. And that's the question that needs to be asked, because until that happens, until those key groups, especially, for example, the Sunni merchant class, the urban middle class, until they join the uprising, it cannot possibly succeed. And that's a key question that needs to be addressed.
And what's your answer to your own key question?
Why are they not joining in?
Yes.
Because they're going to back a winner. I've met a lot of people from this economic strata, and they say we don't like the regime, we don't want them in power, but we don't think the opposition are going to win, and we're not going to throw in our lot with the opposition until we're convinced Bashar is going to go.
We're talking about protesters.
Yeah, I think a key question is who these protesters are in terms of the type of protesters. The key question I think we should talk about is whether the military and whether security forces will stay loyal. There are three options to what will happen in Hama now. One is that the regime gloves aren't off, as was mentioned, and there will be a huge crackdown and it will terrify people into submission. The other is that it will cause people to arm and have a low-level civil war. And the third option is that the security forces themselves will refuse to kill their own people, and there will be some level of defections. Let's remember, the biggest lesson of the Arab Spring so far is in the countries where there has been some form of revolution to date, Tunisia and Egypt, have been because of the top levels of the security forces abandoning the regimes they were built to protect. That hasn't happened in Yemen or Libya, countries that have now descended into some form or other of civil conflict. That, I think, is the key. How many defections are happening now? We've heard about 100 people or so in Abu Kamal in the last couple of days, some things up in Turkey. I think that's a really interesting indices of whether or not where Syria will go next.
Right, so can any of you give us a briefing?
I was going to say that I interviewed a soldier in Lebanon when I was there after I came out of Syria, and he made exactly this point. He left when he could no longer obey his commanding officer's order to fire indiscriminately on women and children. But I think the problem so far about defections like we saw on the scale in Egypt or wavering, there have been no senior officers, I believe, who have defected as yet. Am I right or wrong on this?
Sorry?
There is actually...
Speak up, please.
Fairly recently, there was a colonel from Idlib, which is quite close to Jisr al-Shugur and Marat al-Numan, which were towns that were hit very badly in May, I believe. And a colonel there defected about 1 month ago, and he's now calling for an organisation to be set up within a parallel army called the Syria Free Army. And it's, who knows if this will gain weight. But
the problem with the regime, with defections within the military, is that the military machine that Hafiz al-Assad built previously was designed to be coup-proof. They separated the powers. They have various different spy agencies all spying on one another. They placed people who are loyal to the regime, normally by family tie or ethnic Alawi tie, in the high positions, which means the chances of sort of those officers defecting is far more diminished than perhaps the Junud, the soldiers at the bottom level, which are largely Sunni conscripts. Now, one thing that's interesting about how the army has been deployed is that so far the regime has largely been using the Group 4 division of the Republican Guard, which is controlled by al-Asad, who is Bashar's brother, and they are expected to be fiercely loyal and will fight to the death. The question is, and they're certainly the ones that are largely being used in these widespread sort of massacres, if we're going to call them that, in Hama, Daraa and so on. What's interesting is whether or not you get multiple sources of uprisings like Hama in lots of different places, whether or not the broader army will be able to stay loyal across the board other than just these limited, very, very loyal divisions.
Thanks. Steve Crawshaw from Amnesty International. Just picking up on the point of defections, which clearly we've seen in many different governments around the world, when collapsing of Milosevic in Serbia and many others. Just to say that in terms of international reaction, which there's still been too little of, one of the things which can happen and hasn't happened is the referral to the International Criminal Court by the Security Council. And clearly one of the many signals that comes out from a referral from the ICC to the ICC is the sense that people at the top may or can in due course be held responsible. And that's a very important signal, I think, which Security Council members are picking up on too little.
I throw that really quick answer that. One of the other countries I cover for the Economist Intelligence Unit is Sudan, and believe me, the ICC referral to Omar Bashir has made no difference whatsoever.
Okay, so I mean, in terms of this question of defections, to you, if I can ask you, Omar, in Egypt, the received wisdom is that the military did not shoot on the people. Now, in Syria, they are. Are they right to be shooting on the people?
I would like to comment first on 2 points.
No, will you just answer my question?
Okay, I will. When you are shot at, you shoot back. In my visit to Syria, I visited the Shireen hospital, military hospital, and there were people just lying there being shot. Now, the opposition say they're shooting each other, but they know perhaps they're not shooting each other, and somebody else from the demonstrations is shooting at them, and they'll shoot back. If I were with them, I'll shoot back.
So just, if the army are shooting on their own people, do you think they're right to do that?
They're not shooting at their own people. The opposition are saying the army and the security forces are shooting at each other, but that's absurd. Somebody is shooting at the army, and we have like 1/3 of the casualties so far is the army. You know, when this conflict started, it started with Banyas, if you remember, very early on, with an ambush on the army. And on my route to Jebli, I still can see, I mean, you're all invited, you can still see machine gun posts on the bridges where the ambush took place.
Well, yeah, I don't agree with that at all. I think there's overwhelming video evidence for the deliberate killing of innocent people, women and children. Yesterday I saw, in fact on Barda TV, we had a video of I think it was a 10-year-old girl in Hama who was shot dead. It's a very graphic video, but we showed it anyway because it's the reality. This is what's happening in Syria. And for those who share your opinion, you know, I suggest you visit some YouTube channels and look at these videos and say whether a child or an elderly man would be likely to carry a weapon and fire at the army. I think that's a very unlikely prospect.
Did you show the video, did you show the video of bodies being thrown into the river from over the bridge? Did you show the video of somebody being chopped by the demonstrators? Did you show any of those videos on your channel?
I did see those, but it's very difficult to verify.
But we can't always hear.
I know why.
We can't always hear you. I will give you a microphone. Did you want to answer his question?
Just very quickly, I will not for a minute suggest that the revolution, which is started almost 5 months ago, has been 100% peaceful.
Thank you very much.
I would say it's 95% peaceful, whereas the government's reaction has been 100% violent, and that's the difference.
Okay.
I'm being honest, and you're not.
It was just a small question. I wondered why the state television felt the need to remove the sound when it showed the video of people being thrown into the river.
It did not move all the sound, it only moved the curses.
But I can give you an update for what was shown on state TV during the trial of Hosni Mubarak today, which was soap operas. That was reported by the BBC that the Mubarak trial in Egypt has not been shown in Syria. So we'll move on to the regime now. Could I ask you, Sue, it's common in meetings like this to talk about the Assad family running everything. Who are the regime and how wrong is it to narrow it down to a family?
I think others are better equipped to answer that one than I am. All I would add, my tuppence worth, is how disappointing the Assad family and British educated, and his wife has been with the promise of reform, which they came in with. And this is something I heard time and time again when the demonstration started in April. People really had confidence in this man. Certainly when he came into power, they had huge optimism. I spoke to, if you like, the old guard of politicians. It would be wrong to think that this protest is a new one. When Assad first came to power, the younger Assad, they really believed in a Damascus Spring, in change in Syria. And what happened, what corrupted him, perhaps as I say others can answer this, was he's so weak that he could not stand up to the more bloodthirsty or absolutist members of his family. Huge disappointment. And partly this again has accelerated the protest, in that, if you like, the protest started off by addressing Bashar al-Assad by saying, you know, we believe that you can reform, go on, show us. And when he didn't, this accelerated the protest.
Daniel, is the leader of the regime the weakest point of the regime?
I think there's also a question about who is the leader of the regime. Because to me it's more akin to a mafia family. You might have one person as a figurehead, but nobody really knows. Nobody really knows if Bashar is really calling the shots, or if it's decisions made amongst a small group, the national leadership, which includes mostly members of the Assad family and their close associates, or if it's wider than that, or if it is the man at the top himself.
Hi, just to come up on a couple of points there. About the regime, I think it was the King of Jordan or something who said that Assad he's a prisoner in his father's prison. So I mean, I don't know whether anyone can talk about whether they think that's right, whether obviously he's not stronger than the regime at the moment. And just to pick up on the mafia family idea, I also heard it suggested there's a link there with the Corleone family, because he was the brother who was not supposed to take over. And the question is he Fredo, or is he Michael Corleone? You know, increasingly he's looking like Fredo, but is he stronger than the family, or is the family stronger than him?
It's interesting the notion of being held captive in his prison of his father's making. Actually, Bashar has made quite an effort to remake part of that prison, but in reality it's no better than the one he inherited. Hafez effectively ruled using sort of three different spheres within Syria. The Alawite sect, the Ba'ath Party, and the Armed Forces security services. Now, when Bashar took over, and actually within that, there was opportunity for other people. I would disagree with what you said before about how the different sects have always been manipulated by the regime. I think within that, whilst the Alawis dominated, it was possible for others to sort of exist within that. Now, what Bashar did when he came to power is he really narrowed that down. He hollowed out the party. The party might as well not exist anymore, has no influence whatsoever, it's just a talking shop. And he, even more so than before, merged the Alawi sect and the security and army forces together, which effectively has narrowed the base of the regime so much that whereas before it would have been wrong to say it was just the Assad family, now I think the mafia story is more accurate, which is that, you know, it is totally dependent on the Assads, the extended family, and the various clans surrounding that group. There are one or two exceptions, but there's not that many. And I would just add one more thing about Bashar, sort of the Bashar the reformer turning out to have been overwhelmed. It's quite possible that he was overwhelmed, but I would add this, that Bashar received no training in politics. He's not a politician. He's an optometrist. You know, Hafez and went through the process of sort of, you know, the various coups in the 60s and 70s to learn how to rule in many ways. Bashar's never done that. He inherited power, and this is the first major crisis on his soil that he suffered, and he's completely bottled it and proven that actually it's not about whether he's a good man or a bad man. He's clearly a very weak man who is not able to control the situation and lead.
And you're nodding, but who runs the army? In Egypt, no regime in Egypt has survived without army support since 1925. In Syria, who runs the army?
The army is run in reality by Maher Assad and Asif Shokat, who is Bashar's brother-in-law. There are other people who have titular roles, but when it comes to actually calling the shots, those two people.
Right. I would actually agree with, apart from the Corleone correlation, I would actually agree with you. In a sense, when Hafez al-Assad, the late president, came to power, he came with his own team. And they made a sort of change at the time. When Bashar al-Assad came to power, his father's team was still in power, and they did not listen to his father even anymore. And one of them is closely related to Mr. al-Abdi here. It is very hard to do change, I can tell you that, when there is a mass of people. And when we say regime, you can go from, the top prime minister position to the, lowest level.
So you're agreeing with our friend, he was a prisoner in his father's regime?
Anyone would have been a prisoner in his father's regime.
And to you?
Well, I just want to ask, why should Maher and Bashar and Asif Shawkat and Rami Makhlouf, etc., stay in power?
Yes.
Give me one good reason, or at least 5, if you can.
I can give you 10,000.
Apart from sectarian violence, because that's something that the regime made up to scare people, really. You can use that as an
One of the reasons why, this was touched by Chris, the silent majority who's not taken to the street. Actually, they've taken to the streets once in the 21st of June, when about 8-9 million people went to the streets in support for the president. And that's about 70-80% of the Syrian electorate. Why people take to the streets in such circumstances is not because they like Bashar al-Assad or Maher al-Assad or Asif Shawkat or something, but because they cannot see a light at the end of the tunnel. That's the whole point. We cannot see. I am pro-regime change. I have picked up regime change from inside because I cannot see any other way, safe way, in which you tell me these are the end products and I'm willing to... All they talk about is freedom, democracy, but there are very key questions, very simple questions.
Don't think that answers the question, really.
I am with regime staying as it is for a transitional period in which there is going to be a change, hopefully.
What, another 40 years?
No, but having mentioned that, I think the way things are going, because I've seen that with my own eyes, because of the polarization of the society, it may well go to 40 years if it goes into one winner and one loser.
How much is your salary from the government?
Zilch.
Would you like to comment?
Yeah,
We'll go
I'd
back
like
to the audience.
Try to be very brief. One of the most popular chants at the moment in Syria is Allah la'an ruhak ya Hafiz, which means God curse your soul, O Hafiz. So people are actually cursing him, and he's dead. He's been dead for 11 years. I think it's the first time that any kind of popular revolution where people are cursing someone who died 11 years prior. Because people know that the problem in Syria is not Bashar al-Assad as an individual who might be a very charming man. We never know. But it's the system that he has decided to live with and continue, and actually killed 2,000 people to maintain. So the problem in Syria is the system. Now something else, incidentally, which explains why there have been very, very few defections, and very few even diplomats that haven't defected. Everyone's stayed in their job, unlike Libya, where there have been mass defections very quickly. Hafez al-Assad had a golden rule, which was to anyone who was loyal to him, he was loyal to him. Anyone who was loyal to the regime, to Hafez al-Assad, he was loyal to that person. So that if you're a minister in Hafez al-Assad's government, you could be Minister of Defense for 30 years. In fact, that's what actually happened with Mustafa Atlas, Defense Minister for 30 years. So people who are being co-opted into the government, and I have relatives who are Ba'ath Party members, they know that they will lose their job. Most likely, they probably will lose their job. They're quite comfortable, public salary, public sector job. They'll probably lose it if there was a democracy, precisely because 2/3 of those people will be sacked because they're completely ineffectual and they're not really contributing to the economy. So people remain loyal to the government for a variety of reasons. And you have people who are, on one hand, shabiha, these Alawite militiamen, if you like, thugs, who are loyal to the president. On the other extreme, you have Sheikh al-Bouti, who is an Islamic scholar, who is very loyal to the president, who has actually said it's actually okay to bow down, prostrate to the picture of the president. So it's a wide spectrum of people who have been co-opted by Hafez al-Assad's regime.
Coming to you next, is it even possible that Bashar al-Assad will leave Syria?
No. And precisely, I've recently met someone who came from Homs, who was part of the protest movement there. And he said there is a widespread feeling among the people that what actually runs the country isn't Bashar, or not even just the family, but what they call an Alawite council. This is a council made up of representatives of the major Alawite clans, and they're the ones who decide the fate of the country.
What follows the regime? Should the entire Corleone family be blown up on a fishing boat? What comes next? The consensus across the panel is that we've got an opposition that's unified in its cause, but they're very disparate. They're not organised, they're not coordinated. There's not a process that we've seen in Libya, whether it was right or proper to recognise the transitional council as a question, a different question for another time, but there is a process there should the regime fall. Now this is an argument to justify the preservation of the current Syrian regime, but that vacuum that follows is a very dangerous space. So what follows the regime?
Would you all like to comment on this, starting with you, Daniel?
Yeah, I think this is an idea which from the beginning was put out there that, what else is there? There's this regime. It's, one of the things the regime has always based itself on is its strong position, and so it is like has grown its roots throughout all sectors of society. There is nothing goes on in Syria without something touching the regime, some corruption, something. But I think most of the protesters that I know, that I spoke to, have had enough, and they don't. To be honest, most people say they don't have time to think about what will come after, and they are willing to try that than risk keeping this regime for another 40 years.
I've been impressed by the nascent democracy that you could already see in Syria during the protest, the local coordination committees at the ground level. A lot of Syrians I spoke to were quite proud of what they've achieved so far. You described the scene in Hama. Is it anecdotal or is it true about the pile of weapons that were apparently left to be collected by the protesters in order to confirm the myth that they are armed and they are the ones who are being violent? And the message was sent out by the local coordination committees: don't touch them, it's going to create a situation and give you a reputation that you don't want and you don't need. So Syrians, give them a chance. They haven't had much experience in the democratic process, but it could be a bottom-up process is what we're seeing.
What happens next? What would replace the regime is the question.
I think what's important, it's impossible to answer that question until you actually find out how the regime falls. I mean, one thing that's very difficult to work out is exactly what is the mechanism by which this regime goes. I know I've heard many members of the opposition say that they are really trying hard to separate the army from the security forces and encouraging members of the army, perhaps Ali Habib, the chief of staff, to stage a coup. And if that were to happen, then you'd get, rather like in Egypt and Tunisia, you'd probably get a SCAF type situation where you've got Supreme Council of the Armed Forces trying to work out some kind of transition, but in reality probably trying to protect as many of the old regime's assets as possible. If, on the other hand, if that doesn't happen, it's hard to see how the regime gets dislodged, other than some kind of violent confrontation, some kind of sort of civil unrest that goes on for a very long time, at which point whoever's left standing, I suppose, calls the shots. But don't underestimate the ability for a conflict to completely change the original intentions and aims and objectives of the people taking part in it.
And we have heard that from pro-democracy voices in Egypt, that they have not got their democracy either, because it's another army person in a nice uniform and no women. What about you?
Well, I mean, Syria did have a democracy for a while until Abdel Nasser destroyed it in 1958.
And his question is, what could replace the regime?
What could replace the regime is the continuation of the type of democracy that we had in the 40s and the 50s. It'll just be a case of game on from that period, which is, like I said, the re-emergence of civil society. I think you'll have an alliance between businessmen on the one hand, clerics on the other, and politicians.
And who could lead? Who could replace Assad? Who could lead?
Well, I mean, there isn't. I could name you some names of people who I think are worthy of becoming president at the moment, but I think there will be free and fair elections, and the next president of Syria will be elected fairly.
I think we're pretty much occupied with 3 or 4 people at the top of the regime, but they're not the regime. The regime is hundreds of thousands of people. That's why it's very hard to change. And if you kill the president and the president brother and the head of the military service, that's not changing the regime. The regime will remain. That's all.
Do you think the regime has the capability to administer an internal purge? Or is it too late for that?
An internal
purge.
As in cleaning. Okay.
Well, would you like to say that, Danny?
I mean, this happened before with Abdul Halim Khadam. After Hama and after the events in the early 80s, the several top members of the government began to back off from what had been done in Hama. And they were tricked. They were sent on a diplomatic mission abroad. And since then they've had to live in exile. So I think it's possible, but by this stage I think this is highly unlikely.
I think you've been misinformed on this one. Khaddam remained, vice president until 2005.
No.
He was not sent on a diplomatic mission before. He only defected after the Hariri assassination. Can you continue?
Do you want to react to that? You were misinformed.
Yes, I think you were. Yeah.
Perhaps I got the name wrong.
I think perhaps you have.
Perhaps it's referring to Hikmat Shihabi, possibly.
No, Hikmat Shihabi left also in 2000.
People say he was pushed.
Okay, so far the international response has been mixed or incoherent. What is it, in the panel's view, that the international community should be doing, and what is it that the regime is most afraid of the international community doing?
Right, I'm sorry, I'm going to take the second part of your question only, because we're just keeping it in themes, but international intervention and the lack of it will come later. But would you, the second part of it, what is the regime most fearful of? Would you like to tackle this?
Can I just ask her question, because I think I could
You can ask her a question, but not at this moment.
All right.
I think the regime fears most of all. Well, first of all, the regime knows NATO is not going to get involved. The West isn't going to get involved in Syria because it's too messy and there's nothing worth fighting for. But they're most afraid of Turkey, because Bashar al-Assad, I think, made a strategic error when he embraced Turkey 10 years ago and he basically invited Turkey into Syria to set up their factories and employ thousands of Syrians. The downside, as far as the regime is concerned, is that Turkey now can turn around and say, we invested in you, you got to do what we say, or at least you got to take our advice on board, which so far he hasn't done. And Turkey is a very powerful country, and I'm very sure if the Turks decide to get involved, they can sweep the Syrian army off the field in a matter of days. Sue?
And then why is Israel always the big enemy? Can I ask Amar that question?
Why
in terms
is
of what the
Israel-
government is afraid of in terms of outside influences? We hear time and time again that it's Israel who's stoking the fires of discontent.
Right. We demonstrated as a group, the Syrians in Britain group, we demonstrated outside the FCO. We said that the way to tackle the Syrian issue is not threats and sanctions, it's about engagement. With regards to Israel itself, it's actually a key point in this, not only to forbid NATO from coming in. It's not that Syria doesn't have oil or anything that cannot attract NATO people to come in. That is an element indeed, and I agree with Mr. Abdi on that one, but actually Israel is the other element. Because if cornered, the regime may be feared to, mess up with Israel a little bit, and nobody wants that. So.
And the question from the floor was, what does the regime fear?
I'll answer that. Israel isn't the enemy. Israel is a great friend to the regime. If Israel didn't exist, the regime couldn't stay in power. It is the excuse for everything. The Damascus Spring in 2001-2 was finished when Israel marched into the West Bank. It is every time. Ariel Sharon was a godsend to Bashar. He kept him in power. They actually are a huge fan. They call. They say. They always complain that, so the protesters always complain that, Bashar is a rabbit in Golan. He doesn't ever do anything in Golan, it really is a huge benefit to have Israel there. If they didn't have it there, they wouldn't really have the raison d'etre. But what the regime are really afraid of, to answer your question, yes, I agree with Turkey and from a military perspective, but actually what they're really afraid of is the Syrian people. What they're really afraid of is Hama in central Aleppo and central Damascus, because they wouldn't be able to contain it. And what they've been trying to stop is Tahrir Square.
And it's the second time you've drawn our attention to this, because we're all here for a briefing from you on the panel. Is you're saying this big undecided middle, that's what every
50% of Syrians live in Aleppo or Damascus. You've had very small protests there so far. That is your tipping point. If you get those people out day in, day out, perhaps during Ramadan or afterwards or whatever, to the point that was made before about the ability for the armed forces to contain it, that's too great a number to suppress.
Yeah, very quickly, to come on this Damascus, Aleppo, because I keep hearing it over and over again. First of all, central Damascus is not where real Damascenes live. Okay, it's a business district. That's like saying, why isn't the city of London, everyone demonstrating in the city of London? So obviously there's not going to be demonstrations in those areas, especially in the affluent districts, because that's where all the officers have their villas, so no one's going to dare go to those areas. In fact, the majority of Damascenes, because of the property prices have gone up, they've actually moved to the suburbs. So places like Douma and Harasta and places like that, that's where the original Damascenes who would have lived in the central Damascus 50 or 40 years ago, now they live in the outskirts. As for Aleppo, I think the most convincing case I've heard why there haven't been any major demonstrations in Aleppo is simply because in Aleppo the private sector is considerably larger than any other province or city in Syria, and the businessmen in Aleppo, who employ thousands of people, have benefited from the regime. They had this sort of Faustian pact with the regime, that the regime will give them a lot of business in return for their loyalty, and that's why a lot of people who would have otherwise demonstrated, they don't, because they risk losing their job.
And I just add some corroborating eyewitness evidence about what you say about Damascus. And what struck me when I was there on Thursday night, Damascus goes into virtual shutdown. There are kind of satellite suburb areas around the city itself, and Damascenes can't move. There are roadblocks, army and soldier and police roadblocks, in order to prevent what they do dread, which is a demonstration on the size of Tahrir Square.
Hello? Yeah, sorry. Just an open question. Syria is part of a chain that goes from Algeria to Iran. Another very important link in that chain is Libya, and Gaddafi was Daddy's favorite friend. If Libya falls, no one said anything about how that might impact Syria. Would it lose some kind of support? Would that affect it in any way? Because there's clearly some kind of a three-legged stool principle. If Libya goes from this equation, could that affect the regime in Syria? Would that weaken it? What does anyone think about that?
I mean, I think it would be a psychological defeat, but I don't think it would be anything. It would be something which was used by the opposition, but I don't think it would be a physical defeat.
Okay, the front of the room here first. If there's a microphone near you for that.
In all this, how is the economy doing, the food and the fuel supplies?
Okay, the question was the economy, the food and the fuel supplies, and we're in the section which we're transitioning from talking about the regime to the future. But you keep mentioning the economy. Would you like to give us a briefing?
The economy is not in very good shape at the moment. You're seeing, I would summarise, it's not in very good shape, but probably not as bad as other people are making out. The opposition like to give sort of a narrative of the economy's collapsing. We're days from all the money running out. People are taking all their cash, converting into dollars and running to Lebanon, and the currency is going to devalue, and everything's going to collapse. In reality, that's not happening. You are seeing a decline in economic activity, obviously, especially in places where there are protests, but also in Aleppo and Damascus, where there aren't that many protests. People are not going to make, they're not going to buy a big Mercedes if they think it's going to, if they can get hold of one. But they're not going to buy a brand new car if they think it's going to get set alight anytime soon. So consumption is down. However, oil prices are through the roof. About 15% of Syria's GDP comes from oil. It's still being exported. They're still making money from that. Agriculture, having had a very bad couple of years with drought, has picked up. That's about 20% of the economy. That's still working. They're still trading with Turkey. They're still trading with Iraq. It's very important, the Iraq dimension that no one really talks about. About 25% of Syria's exports goes to Iraq. It's absolutely key. And Iraq has just agreed to give discounted 10,000 barrels of discounted oil to Syria. So, whilst the economy is looking bad and certainly much worse than it has been in recent years, it's not quite as bad as it's been made out.
Just from the what you're all telling us in different ways, I'm learning something new every time. But I wonder how many of us in the room knew that about the oil. To you at the back.
Yes, just quickly, one point and one question. The point was, Ammar earlier said that there were 9 million people demonstrating, carrying out pro-regime demonstrations in Aleppo and Damascus. I can honestly tell you that if you could guarantee half the degree of safety to anti-regime protests that you can guarantee for pro-regime protests, you would see a lot more people demonstrating against the government inside Aleppo, in the center of Damascus. And in terms of a question linking the point about the economy and foreign players, there's been a lot of rumors about the House of al-Saud and the Saudi government being on one side of the fence one day and then switching the other day. What is going on? I wonder if the panel can help us here.
Okay.
Yeah, it's rather typical actually of Saudi Arabia to sit on the fence. In fact, I wish it was just sitting on the fence, but actually I think I've heard many Saudi friends who have told me that we are with you as a people. The Saudi people are with the people of Syria, but our government is actually with Bashar al-Assad. The problem with the Saudi faces is that if the regime of Bashar al-Assad falls, people will then be thinking, okay, who's next? Let's take on the Saudis. Let's promote democracy in Saudi. Let's let women drive in Saudi. So that's why the Saudis are probably reluctant to see Bashar al-Assad fall. Also, the Saudis are the guardians of the Arab system. This is this wonderful system that says, don't get involved in anyone, so neighboring Arabs' internal affairs. So people could be butchered next door, look the other way, and just, you know, this is the Arab system. And the Saudis are very proud of this system because it's kept them in power and it's kept their influence, served them well over the years. And that's why they probably don't want Bashar al-Assad to fall.
Okay, so we're now going to go and talk about possible outcomes, but let's just go around the room. I mentioned at the beginning, if you're missing things or you came into a room hoping to hear something, let's do that now, the bits that weren't cleared up, and then we'll go to possible outcomes. But your questions first, then you in the middle there, then you at the back.
Okay, I had a question that relates to the future, if what would happen if the regime does fall. Is there an educational movement within the protest to educate people about democracy and how it works? I'm asking because I know that in Yemen, in Change Square, where the protesters are still camped out, every single day there are pro-democracy seminars, there's lots of education of women, there are illiterate women learning how to read for the first time, learning how democracy works for the first time, and even though, you know, Yemen's in dire straits, there is this kind of constant education happening, which never occurred before. Is there that kind of movement in Syria, or is it much too difficult for them to gather and educate people in that way?
Daniel?
I think it's far too difficult. There is, like I say, it's a very disorganised movement and very disparate. In terms of travelling in the country, it's very difficult. But this is the strength of the movement. You know, it's although there is a lack of education, but there is an understanding of how to do things. It's almost as if there isn't a need for educational programs. People are on a wavelength about this.
Does anyone on the panel have an update of something that was taking place here in the UK about 2 months ago? The BBC and other organisations were reporting protesters outside of the Syrian embassy were being photographed by people inside the Syrian embassy, and those photos were being sent back to Syria, and their families were being forced to either disassociate themselves with them or were being intimidated back there, so that people here, either on Syrian scholarships or visas or known to the known to people here, would be, you know, they would tone down their protests.
Now, there's a woman on the front who wants to comment straight away on that. I'm hoping this is relevant to this question.
Yeah,
Here it comes.
Hi, my name's Laura Patel. I work for The Times. I wrote those stories. The Foreign Office have basically said that they can't do anything unless the protesters involved go to the police. People are nervous about going to the police, so it's kind of in a bit of a deadlock at the moment.
Would you care to just give us your briefing then? To remind us, if you protested outside the Syrian embassy, you were photographed from within. What happened to those photographs?
People told me that they were protesting outside the embassy. They had their pictures taken, they were videoed. People then received anonymous phone calls. They had visits to their house. Some people said that their relatives in Syria, in a sort of very sinister development, had the mukhabarat there visiting their family and telling them, you've got to get your people in London to lay off. It's a clear attempt by members of the embassy to stop people, even in the UK, where we're meant to have the freedom to protest here, to stop people doing that.
Sue, what do you make of this?
It's Newsnight. We did a report on that on Newsnight, but I'm just wondering if anyone who obviously has links within Syria knows whether anyone has had repercussions against their family within the country. Have we heard of serious repercussions?
I don't know yet. I'll have to give me a call after a month. I'll tell you.
And what about scholarships and travel visas and travel bans? Has that been affected?
I don't know.
Okay. Would the panel like to just answer this question? We're moving on to you in a moment. Does anyone have anything to add on this question of photography
Yes,
of protesters?
I think this particular matter was very much exaggerated. Actually, well, you may laugh, but once you hear, you'll understand. Because the problem is that you're not hearing the other voice. That's the problem. So the people who were claimed to have visited someone, they were, you know, in outside the Syrian embassy there are always two demonstrations, one pro and one against. And actually the pro ones, and you can ask the police who are participating in this, are always the subject of intimidation. We've got Mustafa here, who was threatened in front of the embassy of slaughter, and his case is in front of the police right now. We've got Muhammad here, whose van was visited late at night just before the demonstration, and they've written something about it. We are the ones who are being photographed all the time. But with regard to the visit, yes, perhaps. But you know, when those people visited the other people, you know, and that visit was interpreted as threatening. They were just visiting them to calm things down. And I know these people personally.
Okay.
You know,
Right, so
I could.
Could you explain? A picture of them and showing that this is going to go back to their home country.
Okay. We heard you, and we're going to hear from Malik now on this matter.
Yeah, just a quick question. Who is Mohammed Samouri and what does he do in the embassy?
Well, it's. I think he's a diplomatic intelligence attaché, and that happens in all embassies around the world.
He works for the Syrian Intelligence Directorate, does he not?
Well, is there someone at the British Embassy in Damascus who works for MI6?
Yeah, but he doesn't go around intimidating British citizens who are living in
I
Syria.
don't think he ever stepped out of the embassy, because I never saw him outside the embassy, by the way.
So this question is obviously one very detailed accusation about the regime's behaviour of people living in our city. We're moving around the audience, and I remind you, don't leave disappointed. To you at the back.
Yeah, I was just curious as to like how financially solvent the regime is. And secondary, what financial support do the actual protesters have, and where do they get their financing from?
Okay. Brief answers.
Financially solvent, they're again in better shape than we think, but they are losing money quite rapidly. Mostly because they've gone way over budget themselves by promising government employees, who make up about a fifth of all employees, a 20% pay increase the first day of demonstration, which is a bit foolish. There is a real worry that they'll run out of money, and if they do that, they won't be able to pay the security forces who are doing most of the butchering. However, it's also widely expected that their allies, particularly Iran, will offer them short-term loans or even aid in order to cover that deficit.
And can we take it as read that the protesters don't have any money? They're not being funded?
I would delegate that to the guys that have actually been there. I wouldn't want to comment on where they've been funded by.
You still got the microphone? No, you haven't. Well, speak up.
I was just curious as to where the protesters get their financing from, if any.
Where do the protesters get their financing?
Do protesters need that much money to go out onto the streets? And something that I heard from protesters when I asked the question that journalists always do ask, are you getting enough support from outside? What more can the West or the democratic community do? I heard time and time again, don't interfere, because that's playing right into the government's hands. There's paranoia of the Syrian government that everything is either Israel instigated or some foreign power instigated. Stay away. This is our problem. We'll deal with it. You may have read that quite bravely the American and the French ambassadors went and attended the recent protests in Hama, which was brave and maybe was a good idea from one perspective, but others say no, because again it was an own goal in one respect, because it allowed the regime to say, look, you're being inspired by America and by a former colonial power, France. So it's a tricky one.
I just wanted to go back to the economic situation. Can anybody comment on how the rest of the economy is being affected by what must be a reduction in economic output and of course, the complete collapse in tourism, which is a major source of income to Syria. Can anybody comment on what the position of the economy is at the moment?
Would anyone, other than me, want to talk about it?
I just wanted at the time to add to his. I totally agree. The economy is in a better shape than perceived, but they're running out of money, actually. The problem that we have is that the internal economy, which he hasn't touched on, is suffering as well. So, for example, in Hama, after the 21st of June demonstrations, pro-government demonstrations at Hama, the demonstrators, their buses were burned, they were called dogs and so on, and they are refusing to go to the city. And the city must have seen a lot of barricades checking everybody's, where are you from? If you're from the city, you come in. If you're not, you're not. And that affected not only the economy, but people trying to take their A-level exams. So people on the outside, rural areas are not selling inside the city, and the shopkeepers in the city are not selling to the outside city.
Okay, and to you at the back, and then you at the front.
Just wondering, when you said that, Amar, you ain't seen nothing yet, that instantly brought to mind the 1982 massacre in Hama. Is that what you're referring to? And
not
really just the wider panel, how likely is the government to take measures like that, given that we've heard about how the government is basically a continuation from that?
I think to the contrary, the army has been very surgical this time around. Surgical this time around. Compared to what happened in 1982, they have much better intelligence on the ground, and they're moving very softly.
What do you think? Do you think this is a surgical army?
Well, it doesn't seem like one, but I can't comment.
What can't you comment about? They've put tanks in Hama and they've been shooting people. What don't you want to comment on?
compared to 1982, the tanks weren't in the centre; they were outside shooting in.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I mean, on that, I suppose we agree.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems pretty unpleasant, but I suppose what I'm just asking is, do you think that the government could go further and in fact just withdraw from the city and shell it from outside, and you'd have a Grozny situation, which you can see up there?
What I meant.
You have to be brief because we're coming to a conclusion.
What I meant was not what the government could do more, but if a civil unrest does indeed develop, that's what, when you ain't seen nothing yet. That's what I'm saying.
Do you think it's a surgical military response?
No, not at all. Although I do agree that the regime hasn't unleashed its full potential on the civilian population. They could do a lot more damage, and I think they're planning to fight to the death because they know, as well as Iran knows, Hezbollah knows, that if the regime falls, that there will be. I've described the Syrian revolution as the mother of all revolution, to paraphrase Saddam Hussein's famous note. This is the mother of all revolutions because it's a revolution against a morally corrupt system which has been governed the country for the last 40 years. So to be able to uproot this revolution really is a monumental task, and many more people will die, I am very sure. But I think eventually the Syrian people will be victorious.
Let's move on to possible outcomes in the final 10 minutes.
This is a question for everyone here, really, just for people who want to show solidarity somehow with democracy protesters in Syria, besides going to the embassy here. I'd be grateful to hear whether there are any networks that we can join to in this country of people campaigning or doing anything at all to show solidarity with people in Syria.
Thank you for your question, which links to the gentleman I rudely cut off about what international reactions. So let's seek audience reaction and questions on the possible outcomes. Can we take it as read that there's going to be no Western intervention in Syria? Can I just check if anyone on the panel wishes to disagree with that statement? Right. Does anyone in the audience want to predict Western intervention in Syria, or are we in a room full of people saying there ain't going to be any? Get real. Right. You put your hand up. If you better be about to predict Western intervention in Syria.
Western intervention can not necessarily mean always Europe. Turkey is in the middle, can always be Western or not, and there is a strong, in my feeling, there's a chance that Turkey might, to a level, intervene at least on the north part of Syria.
And please, I'm not being rude by cutting off. Go on. What do you know about? Is it because of the refugees crossing there? They'd have to make some kind of response in that part, or is it to make a change in Syria, you're predicting?
It will not be entirely for the benefit of the Syrian people. Governments don't work that way. They work for the benefit of their own people first, and then they look at how they can prop themselves up at the same time. We do have the issue of a lot of refugees going to that part of Syria, so there is pressure on Turkey to intervene for humanitarian reasons. But let's not forget the factor of the Kurdish position on the north of, on the Turkish-Syrian border. Turkey will not want trouble to spill over its borders. It might choose that as a reason to actually intervene.
And panel, would you kindly give us some possible outcomes, which is what we're coming to the conclusion, and we'll come back to the audience.
I'm depressed. As I've said earlier, people told me they didn't want outside intervention because it then plays into the government's propaganda game. We've seen a largely ill-equipped, unarmed protest movement. We've seen a government who is prepared to ruthlessly put it down, and the might is on one side, and the others have nothing to fight back on. I'm afraid I'm depressed. I don't think that there's going to be the outcome most of us in this room would hope.
So do you think it's status quo, more skirmishes in which civilians are killed by either a surgical or a blood-shedding military, depending on your perspective?
I feel it is so. The government has shown no appetite to change, no willingness to budge. People say there have been so many killed now, we are not going back. It is stalemate, and it's going to be a bloody stalemate, and I don't think there's going to be an outcome that any of us are going to welcome in 5-10 years' time.
Does anyone want to make a prediction from the floor? Yes, sir, you've got the microphone. No, you can ask a question if you don't want to make a prediction.
Yeah, I was just saying that it seems like in terms of prospects for change, it's all been pretty bad news, and that the opposition isn't organised, isn't really united. The military is pretty loyal, whether it's Bashar or the family or even 1,000-strong executive. If there is a weak chink and a weak link and any prospect for change, where is that going to come from?
Malik?
Well, I think obviously I'd hate to predict, but I'll try, and I'll say that I see two possible outcomes. First one would be for the government, the regime, to hit a deal with certain elements of the opposition, and for those opposition to try to convince the street that actually if you continue protesting, this will lead to civil war, then everyone will be a loser. So let's just calm down, go home, and let's build on the concessions that the government are going to give you. This is one scenario, and I know there are opposition leaders inside Syria who are willing to entertain this idea. Whether they can sell it to the people, that's a completely different issue. The other scenario is a low-level civil war where people fight back against the army and the security forces. I expect many more will be killed, civilians and members of the security forces. I think it will be very similar to what happened in Syria in the 1980s, when people rose up. You had people carrying out hit-and-run attacks against the army and the security forces. Only difference is, in the 1980s, the people who were carrying out these attacks were isolated from the general population, whereas now I think they will have the full support of the general population, and I think it will be extremely difficult for the army, which is in Syria about 300,000 strong, most of whom are conscripts. It's very hard for that army to remain cohesive if that happens.
And do you reflect what we've heard from some audience members, that Turkey may cross the border? I think that it may cross its...
Yeah.
Do you think that might happen?
Well, Turkey, I mean, is looking around, and obviously Turkey wants to be part of the big game in the Middle East, and you can see that Iran is supporting al-Asad, and if Assad does emerge as the winner out of this, if the revolution fails and Bashar al-Assad remains in place, then obviously Iran will be strengthened and Turkey will be much weakened. So Turkey will have an interest in overthrowing Bashar al-Assad at some stage, maybe not now, but possibly at some stage in the future. And I would remind you that there is a historical parallel. Syria was governed by the Mamluks for a long time, and they were very bad rulers. They were a military elite who did a very bad job at administrating the country, and eventually the Ottoman Turks came in and chucked them out.
And Daniel, Chris and Amar, your own possible outcomes?
First outcome is civil war, potentially, and sooner rather than later, I feel, just from my experience. But I think that's, in a definitional sense, civil war is unlikely with the way the army is arranged. We could see an insurgency, which could last a long time, and I think that could happen fairly soon. Again, perhaps the current situation could continue for some time, I think.
Amar?
Yeah, I think I'm a pessimist on this one. I don't think that this is leading to anywhere easy. There will be a winner and a loser at the end of the day. I agree with Malik that an underground movement could well develop, but at the end of the day, what people feel, on my side at least, is that the president and the government will be able to do some sort of a political solution by which they appease the majority of the people.
Well, I hate to join the chorus of pessimism, but I also would forecast that not a particularly pretty situation. I think that this, unfortunately, has got a lot further to go. I actually think that for all the talk of surgical army attacks and things, there's clearly been a decision to limit the numbers of people killed each day to reach a point that the international community can stomach, and I think that's really unfortunate. And I think that what we've seen so far will just continue for a long time. I think the protest movement will grow, but it won't reach that critical mass. And I'm hopeful that after a long period of time, possibly 6 months or so, there will be some kind of internal coup whereby they can just decapitate the Assads and other members of the existing Alawi elite and members of it, possibly someone like Ali Habib, could take control and try and sell that to the opposition. The problem with trying to sell something to the opposition, of course, is that they're effectively leaderless, and local committees based on region are going to need to be sold the deal, and that's going to be very, very difficult.
Is it fair to characterise your position then as we've heard surgical, which members of the audience didn't really respond very well to? We've heard bloodthirsty. You're implying culling, a sort of a daily limit. That would be your word, would it?
I would say that there's clearly been the regime are not as stupid as a lot of people, make out. They are aware of international opinion. They're also aware of how many Gaddafi killed, and the fear that of another sort of a massacre turned international opinion very quickly. And I think that there is some precision there on quotas and numbers of people that are seen as stomachable for the international community.
And back to the audience, perhaps someone who hasn't asked a question or made a statement. To you don't have a microphone. We're going to give you one. Yes, you do. Sorry, there are people watching all over the world.
No problem. I just have 2 questions for Mr. Malik. What about this army's tools? How is coming to my army, and who support them? How they employed to take it over to kill the generals and the policemen who they control in the demonstration as the law here? And the second thing, one more question: how many percentage they are so far after 5 months? We are 23 million. How many they counted? And if we voted now for Bashar al-Assad, who's gonna win? Thank you.
Okay, it's quite a lot to get to grips with, but I think you're saying there's 23 million people and not very many protesters. Would you like to comment and briefly?
I mean, last Friday, estimates there were about 3 million protesters. That's not bad. 3 million out of 23, 24 million who risked their lives to go and demonstrate. That's pretty impressive. But the easy answer to your question would be to hold a free and fair election with international supervision, and let's just have settle this using an election. I think that's the best thing to do.
Okay, now look, it's 8:25. I said you could ask this lady a question. You can after the panel.
Answer the question she asked.
You can. I'm sorry, but there will be time. Please mix. But we've heard a great deal from the panel tonight. Bashar al-Assad is a weak leader. Iraq is selling discounted oil. Turkey may cross the border. The resistant or the protesters are desperate, but they're determined. We've heard predictions of status quo, and we've had, I hope, a full airing of views in the room. I'd like to thank you very much for your role in the audience, and to the panel for giving us a briefing and helping us an inch further, perhaps, towards understanding the situation. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you.